All right, so let's jump in and let's talk about some randomization. So, randomization. What we're talking about here with randomization is the process of taking a list of subjects that you have and as they come through, putting them into separate groups, like treatment groups, control groups, maybe a third group, maybe a fourth group. And REDCap has the ability of doing this automatically. So, you as the project owner or any of your staff will not know which group the patients will be assigned into. In the second part of the course, we're going to talk about arms and how you can use both of these features together. So you can randomize patients and then send them off in their own directions if there is different data that needs to be collected for each type of patient. So we'll be discussing that as well. So a little background on this sample project here. We're going to be using the sample one today. I don't have any PowerPoints or anything. I think PowerPoint's not the most engaging, but I like live courses, so we're going to go with live courses today. But a little background on this sample one here. You'll have to excuse me, I am a IT guy, so hopefully this makes a little bit of sense that it's probably not going to be the most practical study, but we work with it. My idea here is that we're just having a new drug that's coming out, and the drug is going to be treatment for short-term headaches. So we're talking about a group of people that have consistent headaches, and we're testing out a new drug, and hopefully we can see some results here if the drug is effective at treating short-term headaches, over the course of a couple of months. So we have a few forms here that are created. We are collecting some basic information from the patient. So the patient number for the study, their sex and age. Then we're going to mark a treatment date. So whenever they are getting treatment, we'll mark when the treatment was, who did the treatment, and any notes from the treatment. And that this will be already if they're getting treated with the placebo or with the actual drug. And then from there, very straightforward, we're just going to follow up with the patient every month just to see has their headaches reduced. And we'll go from there. So that's pretty much the idea of the study. It's very straightforward and simple just to prove the concepts of randomization. So that's what we're working with today. So let's talk about how this works. So in our case here, I'm interested in randomizing my groups of patients into two groups. We want to have groups that get a placebo drug and groups that get the actual headache medication that we're testing out. And I want to randomize them in the beginning of the study, of course, so I know where they're going to be and what drug they're going to get for the treatment portion. So let's talk about how that's going to work in REDCap. So I have my form here. I called it randomization. You don't have to call it randomization. You can call it demographics or patient information, wherever it needs to be. That is perfectly okay. I'll just call this patient information. And to start off randomization, we need a question that's going to define all of the groups that the patient can go into. So for this form here, I have a patient ID, a sex, and an age. And now I need to create one more form or one more field outlining the groups that the patient can go into. So I'll call this field a randomization. I'll try and spell that right. And I'll call it random as the variable name. And the choices for randomization will be the treatment group or the placebo group or control group. And I'll hit save. And just like that, I have my randomization. So the reason I'm making this is because I have to tell REDCap a little bit later that says, REDCap, I want you to use this specific field here, and I want you to randomize the patients between these two options. So in this case, if you had more than 2 arms, or if you have 3, 4, 5 arms, you would add additional arms. So you might have a treatment, a control group, maybe a second treatment group, like if you're testing out 2 drugs at the same time, something like that. And you can have as many randomization groups as you'd like. For the simplicity's sake of this example, I'm just going to leave it at the standard 2 there of 1 treatment group and 1 control group. What we'd also like to do is stratify the patients by age groups as well. So let's say for this study where we're going to recruit 100 patients anywhere from the age 18 to 75. So we'll go for that full age range there. And then we want to make sure that we have equal amounts or as even as possible amounts of each age group within the treatment and control group. So hopefully, you never know if people by accident, come in a certain order. Everyone who's 18 might be in the treatment group, and everyone who's 75 might go to the control group, and that's not going to give us great results. So we can stratify our randomization to make sure we have even amounts of age, and we can also do it by sex as well, so we can get males and females equally distributed between both the treatment and control groups. So we'll show how that all works. The base necessity, technically the only thing that you need if you don't want to do any stratification is the randomization, but for any item that's going to be stratified, like age or sex, you'll also need to have a question like we have two of them here. And you could do this by other things too, if you want to group people by, what state they live in, if you want to group people by how much money they make or the zip code they live in, if you want to group people by anything you can imagine. As long as you have a multiple choice question for that, you can randomize them and equally distribute those groups as well. Question came up that says, can we set the percentages of each age group we want in the final sample? Technically you could, yeah. It would have to be done, it would have to kind of be done manually, and I'll give you an example of that in just a moment. So we'll definitely touch on that. It's a good question. Okay, so now I got the setup here, and now I want to start my randomization process, and I want to enable this in REDCap. So from my left side menu, I'm going to go to my project setup menu option here. And this is going to bring me into all the settings for my REDCap project. If I scroll down a little bit, I was a little too trigger happy there. There's this item here called the Randomization module that's on the project setup menu in your REDCap project. So there's the randomization module, and by default it is turned off. It is disabled by default for every project. And I want to turn that on. So I'm here, I'm going to hit enable on the randomization module, and you'll see as soon as I turn this on, a new menu section is going to appear right below it. So I'll show here, if I hit enable, we should see this new section pop up, set up a randomization model. If I hit disable, it's going to disappear. So I will hit enable on the randomization module, and that will turn on my randomization. What it'll also do is make this menu item appear here on the left, so you have quick access to your randomization module. So disable and enable. Once again, this is all under the project setup. Cool. So I'll turn that on, and now I have the ability to set up my randomization module. So I'm going to enter that and click Setup Randomization. All right. Here we are. So one thing to note, and this is the disappointment, unfortunately, and I always hate this part, but REDCap itself does not do the official randomization. This is not going to replace the need for a statistician or someone to make the randomization happen. REDCap is simply the tool that is going to allow you to, click a button to randomize people, but it doesn't do any of the actual scrambling of patients itself. I'll show you what that means and what it looks like as we go on here. So I'm going to use a very straightforward example right now. I'm not going to do any stratification the first time around. We'll come back and loop again and do stratification as I show a second example. But this is our randomization here. And the first thing it's saying is define your randomization model. So in here, we're basically telling REDCap what field is it that's going to determine what groups patients can go into. So in this case, we'll do the randomization field or the random field that we just created, which was the treatment and control groups. So I'm going to select that, and it's also asking, do you want to use stratification? Like we said, right now we're not going to do that. And it also asks, do you want to randomize patients by groups and sites? So if you have a multi-center site or multi-center study, you can also group the patients equally by different sites. But in this case here, we're not going to use any of the stratification or randomizing by groups and sites. We're just going to do a straight one by one people either go into the treatment group or control group, and no other elements will be considered for that. So I've chosen my randomization group, and I hit Save Randomization Model. So right here I told REDCap this is the field that will be being used, that is going to be used to randomize my patients. Now in step two is giving you an example of what your randomization should look like in REDCap. So it gives you a couple of examples here. Example 1 is basic, example 2 all possible combos, and example 3 is 5 times all possible combos. I typically like example 3, but you can check them all out. And it gives you this Excel sheet when you click on the button. So I did that, I downloaded an Excel sheet, and this should open. And now what you're looking at, let me make that a little bit bigger. This is the guts of the randomization. So this is the nuts and bolts of the randomization. And this is exactly how REDCap is going to randomize your patients. This is something that is typically going to be built by a statistician. So this is an example that you're looking at here provided by REDCap, and you can make this however you want it. And the way randomization works is that REDCap is just going to read down this list, and the first patient that gets randomized is going into group 1. The second patient that gets randomized goes into group 2. The third patient that gets randomized goes into group 1. The fourth goes into group 2, etc. And this is where a statistician would come in. So if you have someone looking at your project, they would randomize, maybe do like, okay, the first 2 people go into group 1, then a 1 goes into group 2, the next 3 goes into group 1, the next 2 go into group 2, then 1, then maybe more 2s, maybe then 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And this is where that expertise in randomization comes in. And this kind of also addresses that question before, where you can determine what percentage of people go into specific groups. So if you have, let's say you wanted 75% of people into group 1, you would just make sure to have 75% of the options be group 1, and you'd have very few, or only 25% of these options be group 2. So in this case here, first patient goes into group 1, second patient goes into group 1, third goes into group 2, the next 4 go into group 1, then into group 2, the next 3 go into group 1. And REDCap just reads down this list. Once REDCap gets to the bottom of the list, so in this case here I have 19 potential randomizations, REDCap will stop actually. So in this case here, you would only have the ability of randomizing up to 19 patients for your study. Now, if you expect to expand in the future, maybe you're only planning on 20 patients so far, but there's a slight chance you might go up to 100. It would be good to take your randomization and make sure you have at the very least 100 options to work with. Ideally, you'd want a lot more than that actually, just to be sure that you have the space, because if you run out of Excel options here, REDCap will just stop and say, hey, I can't randomize any more patients. You're kind of on your own from there. So this is pretty much the randomization backbone, or like the guts like we were talking about here. So what I'll do for an example is I'll save this Excel sheet, and then I'll just make a quick sticky note here to show what it looks like. So I'm just going to copy a couple of these so we can play around. So I'll take the first couple of them and then put this here, just as that. And the reason why you typically want to involve a statistician in something like this is because if you want to be blind to the randomization, you don't want to see this chart. So this chart is basically going to give you the exact randomization. So if you want to remain blind, you need to have someone else do it and then upload that chart to your REDCap project without you ever seeing it. So I saved that Excel document that I updated there, and in step 3 it's asking you just to upload the document that you created. So I'll choose the file, and here was the randomization, and I'll upload that file. So I see success, the randomization allocation table was created. And you'll see here in step 3, there's 2 sections where you can upload files. There would be one randomization for use in development mode. So when you're testing out your project, you can add the randomization in there and just test it out to make sure that everything's working as expected. And typically, you would also want to have a separate allocation table for use in production. If you use the same one for development and production, technically there is a way that you would be able to figure out who is going to be randomized into what group next, and it may introduce some bias into the study. So typically you'd want to have similar yet different sheets for both production and development. So I don't need to use a production yet because I'm still in development, still testing. I can upload a production later. Cool. And once that's set up, you get randomization working in your project. So for example here, now that I've uploaded that table, I have my new patient in here. So if I'm adding in a new patient, I'll say they're patient 124. Let's say they're a male and 18 to 35. And you can see now for the randomization question, it took those two options, both the treatment and control groups, and it's replaced those questions with this randomize button. So if I click randomize here, it's going to, in the background, it's going to read off of that Excel sheet and figure out who needs to go where. And like I said, this is also why you shouldn't know what that Excel sheet is if you're a part of the study, because otherwise you'd be able to know who's going where and it wouldn't really be random at that point. So if I didn't know, I could click randomize, and I'll click randomize here to confirm, and then it sets that patient in that particular group. So just to show that it's reading off the Excel, this was the first couple of items here. So the first two patients would be in the treatment group, the third one would be in the control, the fourth and fifth would be in the treatment group. So if I go through a couple of these here, we should also get the same thing for this patient, 125, randomize, and also in the treatment, and the next patient that comes in should be in the control group. So if I do the same thing here, 126, randomize, and that should be the control. So yeah, that is kind of how the REDCap randomization works. It's kind of a half and half, where as long as you have a statistician or someone who's not going to be recruiting patients making the charts, you should typically be okay to use that. But I also just wanted to show how REDCap is doing this, so you understand like the nuts and bolts with it. Let me show another example, this time with stratification, and I want to do a quick recap too of everything that we did to set that up, just so we go through the process one more time. So once again, to do randomization, I'll start from scratch here. So let me just remove our existing randomization. So I'm going to erase our current setup here, and we'll start from scratch. Okay. So once again, to recap everything to set up randomization, I start off in the project setup. From the project setup menu, I make sure that my randomization module is turned on. I click enable on that. That's going to enable the randomization menu to show up underneath, as well as giving me the same shortcut link from the left-hand side. If I click on either the setup randomization or the randomization link on the left, I will be brought to this setup process here. So previously we just chose our one randomization item and we did not use any stratification or randomization by group and site. Then we saved, and then we created our Excel and uploaded that finished Excel file. This time around though, I want to set up a few pieces of stratification. So let's say we want to stratify our randomization, and we want to stratify it by both sex and age. So I'm choosing what my strata are here, and this list is just showing all the fields that exist within REDCap in your existing project, or in your current project here, and it's showing all the ones that are multiple choice questions specifically, because you can only stratify people by multiple choice questions. Because if people type in, what their age is, they might spell out 18. They might type it differently than other people, so it's required to be that kind of like standardized multiple choice question to be eligible to be a strata. So let's say I want these groups of sex and age to be stratified, and I'm still using the same randomization field as my main randomization field to determine either are they going to go into the treatment or the control group, and I'm going to save that here. REDCap is giving me an error, and it's saying that, hey, you already have people who have been randomized using a different set of rules. If you change those set of rules, it's going to erase everything that currently exists for those randomization patients. In this case, we're still just doing development, so that's no problem. It's okay to erase our existing randomizations for our patients. So I hit save, and now my strata is set, as well as my randomization field as we did before. And now we're back to step 2. Step 2 gives us that example where we have 1, 2, and 3. Typically, like I said, I like 3, but you can choose all of them. I like 3 because it gives you like the biggest amount of flavor for your randomization. And I'll show what this one looks like here. just like this. So from our first example, we were just working off randomization, and the patients that come in were just being randomized into group 1 or 2 as it was on the Excel chart. When you start using stratification, you get 2 other or however many other columns for each of the stratification items that you have selected. So in this case here, this is telling REDCap to check for certain criteria before randomizing them into a group. So one other thing too to note is that these numbers here, like the 1s and 2s, like why are they all 1s and 2s? Why don't they say like male and female and that sort of stuff? The 1s and 2s, all of those are referring to what the coded responses are for my questions. So for example, in my question for sex, I have male is coded as 1 and female is coded as 2. So in my Excel document, anywhere where it says 1 represents male, anywhere where it says 2 represents female. And the same thing for my age groups. There's 1, 2, 3, and 4 as my setup group. So group 1 or choice number 1 is between 18 and 35, 2 is 36 to 45, etc., etc. And from here, it's the same thing in age. So you can see that there's my group 1s, my group 2s, my group 3s, and my group 4s. And also the same thing for the randomization. The treatment group is group 1, the control group is group 2. So that's why you're seeing all those numbers. And then when REDCap is using this stratification, it's going to check the responses of the survey before randomizing them. So for example here, if we had someone filling out our form and they said that they were a male between age 45 to 60. This is choice option number 1. This is choice option number 3. REDCap is going to go through the chart and see, okay, where is the first instance where someone has chosen option number 1 for sex and option number 3 for age. And it will find this particular chart or this particular line in the chart, and then the first person to match that will get randomized into this group. So it's like, okay, they match male, which is number 1, they match 45 to 60, which is number 3. This person is going to be randomized into this group. And then the second person that comes in, if it's a female, let's say it's 18 to 30, so it's going to check where is sex 2 or for female and age number 1 for age group 18 to 35, and this is where they would be randomized. And then it would go through the chart. If the same thing happens again, where a male 45 to 60 comes in, it's going to do the same thing and look for the next iteration of this. So it'll say, okay, I've already used this chart here. Someone's already been randomized using this row. Let's see where the next one is, where male is equal to 1 and sex is equal to 3, and it will find this case here and randomize them into this particular group. Unless I missed another one. Oh, here it is, actually. I missed it. Yep, it's actually right underneath. So ages or sex is equal to 1, group is age group is equal to 3, and then it will randomize them into group number 2. And this is the importance of having someone familiar with randomization, looking into this and making this kind of table for you. There are online tools that use it, and there might even be something at Cedars that might do it. I haven't had too much familiarity, but there might be a tool called Rando, I think. Rando 2 or something. If you have questions about that and are looking for a tool to like do randomization, if you don't have any context with a statistician of some kind, or feel free to reach out to us and just ask for something like that, and we can definitely get you some resources on how you can get some randomization done to help build out this chart properly for you. So yeah, there's always resources. There's always ways to get things done very effectively. As for contacting us, if you ever do have a question for anything, even regarding the content we're covering today or anything else, you can always reach us at this Contact REDCap Support button. This is located on the bottom left of every REDCap project. Contact REDCap Support, you can click that and just say what your question is, a general REDCap question, and put your question here, and then we will be happy to answer it. Our REDCap team has been wonderfully expanded over the last couple of months, so we finally have plenty of hands on deck to answer all your questions. So always feel free to reach out. We're very happy to hear from you. Great. So let's say that this stratification table, going back to our example here, let's say that everything that I created here looks good. This is what I wanted to do. Let's say I worked with a statistician. We came up with this, and now we are set. And I want to add that back into my randomization. So here we are on the setup. We've chosen our strata. We've downloaded our template. We've made any modifications that we needed to, and then I can upload that file here. And there should be upload file. There it is. Perfect. And the allocation table was created. So the same thing if I add a new patient in there, and I choose their sex and age, and I click randomize. This time around, REDCap is going to confirm that the sex and age are entered correctly, and then once that's done, I hit randomize, and it establishes them into their particular group. Cool. And once again, like we were talking about before, if you need to modify the amounts of people in each group, it would have to be done in this Excel format before uploading it to REDCap. All right. So that's the basics of setting up randomization in REDCap. Before we move on to the next topic of ARMS and setting people down different treatment paths, any questions on randomization setup? I'll give like 30 seconds, a minute or something. No questions yet. So far, so good. All right. Looking for the resource for the randomization setup. Yeah, I'll have to check my inbox. I think there was a, let's see. Yeah, I'll have to take a scan around for that and see if I can find it. I know it's a long time ago, but I think there was a tool that we had at Cedars that is able to do randomization. Rando 2 is a cochlear implant. Ah, interesting. Okay. I see. Okay, I will do some more research on that and see what we can find. Oh my gosh, it actually is. That's really funny. It's just Rando 2. I see. Oh, Rando 2. Okay, interesting. Rondo 2. Oh, that's funny. I'll get back to you. Yep. All right, so let's jump into our second part of the course for today. And the second part of the course is going to focus on ARMS and sending people down different paths. And this is also going to actually touch on longitudinal data collection, but there's a separate course that goes more in depth into longitudinal collection, but we'll touch on both. So the idea here with ARMS is that you might have two groups of patients and you might need to collect different pieces of information for each set of patients. So in our example here, let's say we still are working on this headache medication and we have our two groups, the control group and the treatment group. And let's say for our main study, we're only interested in tracking the patients for 90 days. So for 3 months after they receive either the placebo or the main drug, we want to track them for 90 days and see how their headache is doing. From that point on, what we'd want to do is we want to stop following up with the placebo group, and then we just want to continue following up with the people who received the treatment medication. So that's where those two paths will diverge. So both groups kind of go up until the 90-day mark, and then from there we stop the placebo follow-ups and just continue with the treatment groups just to make sure that there's no long-term follow-ups from that drug. And so going down these two paths, typically in REDCap everyone has the same forms to fill out, but by using ARMS you can separate who gets what. And I will show that process now. So to start off and set up ARMS, we're starting off in the project setup. Once again, this is the same place we set up the randomization. So I'm going to start here, and we are going to use the longitudinal data collection module here. It's on the top this time. And once I turn on the longitudinal data collection, we're going to get more menus that show up here on the bottom. So let me turn this on and let's see where those menus show up. And it looks like this one here is the one that's related to it. So once again, this is under the longitudinal data collection. I hit enable, and then our define your events and instruments for your different arms. So the longitudinal data collection module in itself is used for tracking data over time. So if you have certain time points and you want to track data at them, even without the use of arms, longitudinal data collection can be used for that. I would recommend checking out our online recording for that just to get some more details, because there are little things to keep in mind when utilizing this tool. But that's, for later and self-research. So let's work on this one right now. I have turned on my longitudinal feature from my project setup menu, and now I want to start off by defining my events. And when it says define my events, it's saying what time points are you interested in. So like there's a baseline. In our particular study, we have a baseline event. We have a 30-day, a 60-day, 90-day, all those good time points right there. So here's my events. And I'm going to define all of my events. So I have my baseline event, and then I have, let's say, a treatment event, and then maybe a 30-day follow-up, a 60-day, everything that happens at 60 days, everything that happens at 90 days, 120, and then, 120 day. And 150 day. Perfect. So those are all of our time points there. And now we can define our second arm. So you can see here on the top, what we just did is defined all of our time points for arm 1. So that's what we were working with. There's also this tab here that says, do you want to add another arm? And in fact, I do. So I'll click add a new arm, and it's going to ask me what I would call it. I'll just call it arm 2. Make it very simple. Actually, we'll call it the control group. Let's rename it. So we'll call this one the control group. And let's go back to arm 1, and I'm going to rename that and just call it the treatment group. There we go. So in arm 2, the same thing. We want to now define the time points for arm 2. So we have the same thing in the beginning. So we have our baseline. We have our treatment. 30-day, 90-day. Or 30-day, 60-day, 90-day. And as we discussed, though, for our control group, we're just interested in stopping at 90-day. We don't need any additional follow-ups from there. We're not going to follow them indefinitely for that control group. But for the treatment group, we want them to have a longer time span. We are also interested in longer-term follow-ups. Heck, we might even want an 180-day follow-up for them. So this will define our different paths here. So a control group and a treatment group. And once both of these arms are set up, we can then define and tell REDCap what information is supposed to be collected at what time points. So I'll go to where it says designate instruments for my events at the top. I can also do the same navigation back from my project setup. So where we were is we turned on the longitudinal data. We went here to define my events, and the next section that we're interested in is designating the instruments for the event. So that's telling REDCap what forms do you want to collect at what time points. So in here, it actually has a list of all of my forms. And actually, let me change the forms here so this kind of makes a little bit more sense for this example. Our previous example was not intended for this kind of collection. So let me just trim this down a little bit here. Make a snapshot. While I delete these forms here, handy tip, at the top of your designer, you have this button here called Create a Snapshot of Instruments at the top. And what that does is it creates an exact copy of what your project looks like at an exact moment. So if you ever get stuck, or like if you ever make a mistake on something and you're like, hey, I knew my project was working 3 days ago, it's not working now, you can actually go back to your previous snapshots and restore your project to how it was if there was ever any mistakes made. Whenever I come in, I always try and just click it once to make a snapshot, as long as I know everything's going good right now, just so I have that as a backup. So if you ever were concerned about making backups for your project, this little button right here is basically your backup button. Handy tips. Cool. So, all right, awesome. So I've trimmed down my list of forms just to these four. So we have our patient information we saw before, the treatment form, a follow-up form, and a study closure. And we'll be collecting the follow-up form, the same follow-up form at all these different time points. So we don't need to make multiple forms when using this longitudinal module that we've set up. So this one kind of helps erase the need for creating multiple of the same form over and over. Awesome. So I'm jumping back here to designating my instruments for my events. And I have my two arms again that I just created. So my treatment group that goes all the way out to day 180, and my arm to my control group that goes out to 90 days. And now I want to designate what information gets collected at what time. So at my time point 1, I'm only interested in collecting my patient information for the baseline. And then at my treatment time point, I'm also only interested in collecting my treatment form. At my 30-day, 60-day, 90-day, and 180-day, or 150-day, I want to collect my follow-up form once for each of those events. And then finally, at my study closure, I not only want to collect my follow-up form, but also my study closure form. So I can add as many different forms that need to be collected at each time point using this longitudinal method. So I've designated them here. And I hit save, and it shows here this is what is going to be collected. A nice visual of this is going to be from the record status dashboard. So if I go to my record status dashboard, here's my 5 existing patients who are all in Arm 1 right now. And we can see the time points that they'll be going through. So here's my baseline, and this is what we'll be collecting there. In the treatment time point, this is what we'll be collecting. In the 30, 60, 90, 120, and 150 days, this is the information we'll collect. It's just that one follow-up form. And then our 180 day is a little bit longer, and we're collecting 2 pieces of information in there, a follow-up and our study closure. And we'll do a similar thing for Arm 2. So from the treatment, I'm going to now go into my Arm 2 for my control and designate what needs to happen here. So same thing at the baseline information, or the baseline, I'm interested only in the patient information. At the treatment time point, I want to collect my treatment information. And then for our follow-ups at the 30, 60, and 90 day. And at the last item here, the last visit, I want to get my study closure information from the patient. And I'll hit save, and we can see how that's been marked. All right. Any questions on this configuration? What questions do you have about this configuration? One other thing that, it's very flexible too, which is really nice. Like for example, maybe patients could close out the study at any of these 30-day, 60-day, 90-day. Maybe they just want to stop. I could add in the study closure form to every single time point. So if the patient ever wants to leave the study, I can just say, okay, this patient closed out at the 30-day mark, and I can fill it out here. I can just get their feedback, how was the study? So it's very flexible, and you can add forms in at any time point, which is really nice. In this case, I'm just going to remove those. So we have this set up, and now we want to talk about the randomization. So we have our randomization here, and this is where things start to get a little bit complicated. You can't have any advanced REDCap course without any bit of complicated piece, so here's the complicated piece coming in. So we have our 2 arms that are completely different paths. Arm 1 goes down this 180-day path, and Arm 2 goes down our 90-day path. Whenever you add a record into these multiple arm projects, you get to select what arm the patient is going to at the beginning. So I choose either Arm 1 or Arm 2. But the problem is I have to decide this before I get to my randomization form. So if I want to add patient number 5 into my project at all, I have to choose at the beginning what arm are they going to belong to. In this case here, let's say, I don't know, I need them to be randomized. So I'm going in here, and this is the only place now where I can access my randomization. So Here's our randomization. Looks like our randomized button got taken care or got removed from our second arm, but it should be working on our first arm. There it is. Okay, great. So here is our randomization button, but they're already in group 1, so it doesn't really help us out. So the way around this that we've seen, we've tried to find out what the best way to do this would be to randomize people into multiple groups, is actually to make a third arm specifically for randomization. So you have arm 1 treatment, arm 2 control, and then I'm going to add a third arm, and I'm going to call this randomization. And the only purpose of this arm is to randomize where the patient's going to go. So in this case here, arm 3, and we'll call this the randomization event or randomization. And in the randomization, we have to say what's being collected here, and we just want to do the patient information because this is where the randomization will occur, in that patient information there. So once that's done, typically you wouldn't have to do this, but because we've already set up the randomization, we have to reset it up to work properly with the third arm. So I'm just going to reset this here. So the randomization needs to be set up for that third arm. So I'm just going through and setting up the randomization again. Typically, you wouldn't have to reset up the randomization over and over again, but in this case here, because we've already set it up, I have to go back in and just reset it. Apologize for that. That should do it. Great. Cool. So now the process of randomizing and then setting patients down the correct path is a little bit complicated, but it works. So we have our third group, our arm 3 is randomization. So we start everyone off in the randomization arm. So regardless of if they're going into arm 1 or arm 2, they all start here. And then we add a new patient into arm 3. We put in their basic information and then randomize them. And then from here, whatever group that they get randomized to, so in this case they got selected for the treatment group, I go back in and I remake their record in that particular group. So I know patient 128 is going into the treatment group. So I go in here, I add them into the treatment group, and I just make sure that they go in here. So this is patient 128, and I move their information over. So now, in a sense, we have all the patients get randomized in this arm 3, and then after they get randomized, I re-add them or add them a second time to their appropriate arm. So that patient here has now moved to arm 1, and this is patient 128, and they have their same information here. It's a little bit complicated if you need to do both the arms and the randomization and separate, but it is possible there. So I just wanted to highlight that and show that process. Whew, that's a lot of talking. How many did I lose? How many people are like, whoa, what's going on, and scratching their head? Any takers for that one? Or did that translate well? Not sure. Confused as to why this part was necessary. Like the third arm, the randomization arm. Cool. So the randomization arm is necessary because you have to, like if you're adding new records into your project, you have to decide which group they go into before you have the ability to hit that randomize button. So the record needs to be in an arm before you're allowed to hit the randomize button. And so you don't know if they belong in the treatment or the control group. But you have to assign them to a group. So in this case, like, let's say I'm making a brand new patient. I have to choose what arm that they're in, but I don't know yet because they haven't been randomized. So I'll start them in this third group, so at least I can go into their record and hit this randomize button. So in this case, they're now in the treatment group. It's like, okay, I now know what group they're supposed to be in. I then go in and then make them a record in their appropriate group. So, okay, this one's for the newest patient, 129, and move their information over. Not sure if that helps. Hopefully that helps. Let's see what else we can talk about here. There was something else that I felt was good. If you don't need to, if you are doing the randomization outside of REDCap, you don't need this third arm. It's only if you're using the randomization module within REDCap and you have two separate paths for your group where you'd want to use this. One other thing to note too is that if both of your groups of patients for your treatment and control are following the exact same schedule, you don't have to use this longitudinal method at all. This is only being used in the cases where you have two separate arms that have two different paths that they're going down. So in this case, arm 1 here is going all the way to 180, arm 2 is only going to 90. But if both of my arms were going out to 180, I could skip this whole process because I don't need to separate people into two different paths. That is the main use of the multiple arms. So question is for arm 3 is for when you have already set up your randomization and then you add a new patient. Yes. So arm 3 in this case is only going to be used in cases where you want to use the randomization built into REDCap and you want two separate tracks for patients in your same project. So that's the only use case for arm 3. So if you're doing randomization outside of REDCap, don't have to use it. If both of your patients have the exact same treatment path, both the control and treatment, they have the exact same schedule, you don't need to use it. It's only useful in the case, where you have both the requirements of randomization is being done in REDCap and you have two groups going down separate paths. Cool. All right. So thanks for asking these questions, by the way. Much appreciated. Very much appreciated. Cool. So let me actually just turn off arm 3 there. So in this case, let's say we were not using randomization in REDCap, and we can just add new patients in. So I go to my usual add edit records and be like, okay, we know this patient's going into the control group. I can add them in there. And I don't have to do any randomization, and they can just go down their schedule. Another question came in that says the person doing this data entry will never be blinded to the treatment status, right? Ooh, that's a really good question, actually. That's a great way to finish off the course. Let's talk about that. So how do you blind people from randomization? So yeah, that's a great point because typically when people see their record, you would go in and you would see, okay, where is this patient randomized to the treatment group or the control group? So if you wanted to blind that to somebody, let me revert back to where we were earlier. And let me use that snapshot and just, let's revert back to where we were. Here we go. Okay. Oof, nice. Okay, it looks like our numbers got a little messed up. That's all right. So yeah, we have our randomization right now is in the same form as the patient ID, the sex, age, and the randomization. So anyone who's filling out this form can see what group they're randomized into. If I wanted to blind this from my staff, I could actually make a separate form called randomization. And then I can take that randomization question and move it off of the patient information form. So in this case here, also handy tip, check it out. There's this little button here that's useful for moving forms right next to the X button, and you can move it to separate forms. So for example, I can take this field and move it into my separate form right from here. So it's a handy thing to just side tip. And now I have my randomization form all by itself up here. So it's either the treatment or the control group. And the nice thing with this is that you can blind everyone in your study from this specific form. You can't blind people from individual questions, but you can blind people to an entire form. And you do that through the user rights menu here on the bottom left. So under the user rights, I can pick and choose who gets access to what specific form. So I'll click on user rights. In here, let's say I have just myself. Let's say I'll add in one of my staff here. So I put in their username and I hit add with custom rights. And there's the usual rights on the left-hand side, but then on the right-hand side, I can pick and choose what they can access. So if I hide the randomization from this individual user and add them to the project, they will not be able to see what group that they're randomized in. So for in this case, you will need one person who's in charge of the randomization, but then everyone else will be blind. So let's say I'm in charge of the randomization. I come in to my project. I randomize this first patient here. I hit randomize and be like, okay, they're in the control group. I know that as let's say I'm the just the coordinator who's doing the randomization. Now I have my two groups here, or my two patients. If I were to then be a study staff, so for example, I'm now a study staff member, and I log in. So right now I'm pretending to be my study staff member, and you can see they do not see the randomization field at all. So when they log in, they only see this information here, and they start off in the patient information. They click on that. There is no indication whatsoever on which group this patient is in, so they don't know, and it's fully blinded to your staff. In a case example like this too, I would also recommend maybe setting up a group in your user rights. So here in the user rights, you can actually assign a role down here, and a role is basically a level of access that you can assign people to. So you can imagine like, okay, anyone here is data entry, anyone there is going to be a project manager, anyone there is going to be data quality, and then they'll get different privileges based on what role you assign them to. So if you have data entry blinded maybe as the role, I can create that role and say they get no access to the randomization. And then I can assign any of my users to that blinded data entry. So if I wanted to move over my, if I wanted to move Kevin over, I can either click his name if he already exists and say assign him to the data entry blinded role. If I had new people that I wanted to add into my project, I can choose their username and also assign them to their specific role. So I'll assign them to the blinded role, and then maybe I'll do one more. And now none of these users have access to seeing that randomization status. That is a fantastic question. Thanks for asking that. Yeah, no worries. Anytime. Yeah, thanks for stopping by. And actually, yeah, that does bring us to the end of the hour. So hopefully everyone got something out of this one way or another.